Top stories for the hour. Scholar reiterates African solution for African problems is making a significant difference. And Ethiopia observes 86 Matters Day. Hello and good morning. You're watching at this news hour with Zanusa Binam Gitana. Thank you for watching us, and I'll get back to stay tuned. Welcome back. Now the news in full. During the 36th African Union Heads of States and the Government Summit, a scholar approached by ETV reiterated that African solution for African problems is making a significant difference in the case of Ethiopia. He also added that the Ethiopian Green Legacy Initiative could be such exemplary to the people of Africa. Tigist has compiled the full story. Take a look.
Approached by ETV press writer on African affairs, Maki El-Mograbi reiterated that African solution for African problem is making a significant difference in the case of Ethiopia.
Yes, I think this is an African Union slogan, and it has been implemented in the Ethiopian case in Pretoria Agreement. And not just that, even when I attend Libyan events and I talk to Libyan officials, just like the official from the the Transition Presidential Council and the spokesperson Najwa Wahiba, they said that African solution is African problem for African problems is making difference, especially in the case of Ethiopia and many other cases. And they count on the African Union to continue an African solution for African problems.
He further stressed that in some parts of Africa, enabling free movement of people across the continent has a positive impact on the implementation of African Continental Free Trade Area.
I think the continental level, some achievements happened, and people they don't give attention or focus on what happened in some cases or some sectors. I think the free movement in Africa started to appear. Some African countries, they give African citizens visa on arrival, including Ethiopia. They give more than 30 African countries in Africa or in sub-Saharan Africa visa on arrival, and that is a development regarding the free economy in Africa, and it make difference, positive difference on the issue of implementing AfCFTA.
The writer further added that Ethiopia's Green Legacy Initiative could be a model for African people.
As a person that I follow up the environmental things, I am aware of the big achievement that happened in the Green Legacy in Ethiopia. And I think it could be a model for African people.
During the 36th ordinary session of heads of state and governments, the 21-years-old AU dwelt at length on ways of accelerating the African free trade area. Climate change also received a fair share of the AU summit's focus. The direction put forward to tackle institutional reform as well as peace and security are expected to lead a great leap forward. Tigist Nisa reporting for EBC inside the AU headquarters at Addis Ababa.
Mexico. In 1887, the city was founded by Presbyterian, and it was named.
Once again, welcome back. You're watching at this news hour. Now we are in our trending segment where we see pertinent issue of concern that took place over the past 24 hours. Of course, there has been significant story taking place in the capital, Addis Ababa, with regard to the 36th ordinary session of the African Union Heads of States and Government Summit that has been successfully conducted here in Ethiopia. To tell us more on this, I'm joined with my colleague Kidana Baina. A very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Peter.
So, as I've been mentioning on the beginning, the 36th ordinary African session has been successfully conducted here in the capital, Addis Ababa. And what are some of the pertinent issues that have been addressed by, those leaders in their respective position?
Well, like you said, the 36th ordinary session was opened here in Addis Ababa at the headquarters of the African Union on February 18th. Now, the opening ceremony saw these heads of states and officials tackle a number of issues regarding economic challenge as well as political instability across Africa. Now, a key message on the first day, however, that we need to focus on is that Pan-Africanism, solidarity, and brotherhood were preached. And in line with that, actually, I'd like to mention a tweet by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in which he said, reinvigorating and recalibrating Pan-Africanism requires us to disrupt the status quo and leap into the future. Potentials need to be changed into products, etc. So the main point from this tweet and from the opening speech that Musa Faki Mohammed, the African Union Commission chairperson, actually said was that we Africans need to stick together and promote the concept of Pan-Africanism. But in addition to that, the integration of Africa, rebuilding Africa from various health and socio-economic problems, the continent's peace and security, socio-economic development, as well as the representation of Africa in multilateral international institutions took center stage at this summit. And the chairperson of the African Union Commission also addressed the harsh conditions that many Africans have had to deal with and that the continent has been pilfered with, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and also the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which have had a very long-lasting impact on the continent. In addition to that, the new chair for the AU going into 2023, who is the Comoros president, Azali Assoumani, he also drew attention to something that is a big challenge for Africa, and that is debt. Now, the big number that is standing in the way of Africa's development, and he rounded it up to $1 trillion, which is required to pay off the debt of the continent, and he added that alleviating this debt is actually one of the main agendas for this year. And according to him, again, he plans on actively mobilizing the UN's present $150 million fund from which many African countries can benefit. Now, breaking that down, the Democratic Republic of Congo will be receiving $23 million, Sudan will be receiving $20 million, and in addition to that, the operations or aid operations in Burkina Faso, Chad, and Niger will get around $10 million each. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed also made an appearance. Now, going into another note, on Saturday, he addressed the truce that was reached between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF, of course, and he mentioned that to stress the fact that we need more African solutions to African problems. And on that note, President Macky Sall, who is the outgoing chair of the African Union, also said that this year's summit offered a historical, and I quote him on this, a historical opportunity to close the doors of African conflicts and open the door to African solutions. He also, again, raised the issues of unconstitutional change of government or power in this regard, which is becoming an increasingly common issue or occurrence in Africa, and it's a barrier to development. And he said, Musa Faki Mohammed actually also raised this in his opening speech as something that is disruptive to the African continent. Meanwhile, on a more positive note, the chairperson of the African Union Commission also said that the continent is making progress in terms of silencing the guns, because the Union has been working profusely in regards to this. And among the pressing challenges for the Union has also been combating terrorism across the continent. We can mention Mali, Burkina Faso, Somalia, as well as the Lake Chad region, which these areas were a priority at this year's summit. And in fact, on the sidelines of the AU meeting, the regional Regional, the ECOWAS, or the Economic Community of West African States, mentioned or reaffirmed the sanctions that they are imposing on 3 Sahel regions in this regard. They decided to impose travel bans as well on government officials or senior leaders in those countries where unconstitutional transition of power took place. So all these 3 countries that are under the sanctions of the ECOWAS are under pressure to return swiftly to a civilian rule by 2024 for Mali and Burkina Faso, and a year later for Guinea. Furthermore, apart from...
let me interrupt you. That's a very good presentation that you are doing, because you've mentioned the significant stories addressed by the respective leaders. But let me take you back to Macky Sall, who have mentioned some of the challenges that Africa is facing. One of it is the rise of terrorism and unconstitutional change of government that has been repeatedly a challenge for African continent entirely. And then I hope this summit could come up with its own solutions in order to make Africa a better place for development and inclusive transformation. Speaking of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, when it comes to the peace accord that the government of Ethiopia has shown, many African leaders have been appreciating the commitment of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and of course the Ethiopian federal government for the active role that have been playing in the peace agreement in Pretoria. In this regard, how do Africans really learn from the experience of Ethiopia, and how has that been important when it comes to solving African problems to African solutions?
Well, one thing that I'm going to go back on again is that Macky Sall stated that this year has been significant in terms of making sure that we close our chapters on African conflicts and look at African solutions. Now, the peace accord for Ethiopia is something that is, one might call historical, because it is the first instance that saw African problems being resolved by the African Union, the peace accord, which is a very big achievement, we can call it. And so from this, we can draw that we've shown the potential that African countries can come up with solutions for African problems. And this shines the light on the potential that we have in terms of kind of not closing ourselves up, but actually internally solving our disputes and moving forward without any foreign intervention or relying on external actors, because that's how you really open yourself up and become vulnerable. And that's one big lesson I believe that has been drawn from the peace agreement that has been reached between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF. So going forward, this is something that other countries, other African countries, can draw lessons from.
Yet again, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has addressed a very core point with regard to the global challenge that Africa is facing, while the root cause is lying elsewhere. So in this regard, how do you see this very point? Well, on that regard, I'm going to mention climate change, actually, which is something that was raised at this summit. And one thing that the new chairperson for the African Union for 2023 emphasized on is, apart from the capitalization of resources, climate change is posing a very big challenge for African countries. Despite being one of the lesser contributors to the climate change, it is being disproportionately affected, is what he said. So this summit actually sort of invited or encouraged African countries to make their voice heard, like they did, according to Assoumani, at the COP27. And another interesting development actually at this year's summit is the relationship between the Afro-Arab relationship. And it was the Secretary General of the League of the Arab States that announced the African Union project to develop the Afro-Arab free trade, which is bolstered by the presence of non-member Arab states such as Qatar, which, as we all know, is gas-rich. And that's what we saw in Saturday's session. Yeah, on the African continental free trade area, one of the greatest challenges that have been raised by different respective leaders is the integration of infrastructure, which is supposed to be addressed in the coming implementation. What do you say about it? Right, okay, so the African continental free trade area is actually the theme of this year's summit, and I was going to that. Now, at the end of the summit, the bloc's new chairman, which I mentioned, Assoumani, said that leaders had agreed to accelerate the implementation of this peace deal. And the African continental free trade area is known as one of the biggest in the world in terms of population, which gathers around 54 countries out of the 55 of Africa, and that totals to a population of around 1.4 billion. So African countries, it's to just mention a bit of a background on this, African countries present only trade around 15% with each other. So this continental free trade area
aims to boost this by 60% going into 2034 by eliminating all tariffs or barriers to the trade between African countries. But the implementation, as you mentioned, has fallen short of that goal. And one of the things that's mentioned by the AU Commission Chief, Moussa Faki Mohamed, is that it's a strategic deal, but it still lacks the infrastructure that would enable us to implement it. And one of the things that he mentioned was that 600 million Africans still do not have access to electricity, and that's one thing that he said. But something sort of optimism to hold on to is that Assoumani's statement, who's the new chairperson for AU going into 2023, said that he would leave, and I quote him, "no stones unturned to ensure that this becomes a reality." So I think we have some hope to hold on to.
I do hope we have several issues that we can cover in the coming time. And Kidana Baina, thank you so much for coming to the studio and sharing more light on this pertinent issue. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
In other news, the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia President Sahle-Work Zewde held discussion with the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, on ways to strengthen Ethiopia-EU relations. In the discussion, they advised on ways to further strengthen Ethiopia's relationship with the Union. They agreed to further strengthen Ethiopia's strong relationship with the European Council. Their discussion also covered current state of affairs in Ethiopia. Meanwhile, European Council President Charles Michel expressed his satisfaction with the peace agreement reached between the Ethiopian government and TPLF. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has made and held discussion with the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, on the sidelines of the 36th ordinary session of the Assembly of Heads of States and Government of African Union. The Prime Minister and the European Council President focused on progress made by the Ethiopian government on the peace agreement, development endeavors in EU relation. The Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed also held bilateral discussion with the President of Tanzania, Samia Suluhu Hassan, on the margins of the ongoing ordinary session of the Assembly of Heads of States and the Government of the African Union in Addis Ababa. The Premier also held a bilateral discussion with the Vice President of the Presidential Council of the State of Libya, Abdullah Hassan Al-Afi, as well as the State Minister of the UAE. Similarly, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Djibouti President Ismail Omar Guelleh inaugurated and opened the new Djibouti embassy built in Addis Ababa. According to the Office of the Prime Minister, the ceremony was attended by ambassadors and diplomats, including IGAD Chairperson Workneh Gebeyoh. In other news, exactly 86 years ago, the fascist Italy invader led by the East African Viceroy Marshal Rudolf Graziani unleashed the most horrible terror against Ethiopians. On the day, 30,000 innocent Addis Ababans were mercilessly murdered when two Ethiopian air tyrannies, Moges Asgedom and Abraham Deboj, threw a grenade against Graziani in an attempt to kill him. The day was observed here at the Yekatit 12 Mattes Monument at the 6 kilo area of Arada sub-city. Officials, including Addis Ababa City Administration, Mayor Adanecha Abebe, President of the Ethiopian Patriots Association, Lij Daniel Jote Mesfin, have laid raise at the monument to honor the martyrs. Speaking on the occasion, Mayor Adanech said Ethiopia has maintained its independence by the sacrifice of our forefathers. In another domain, Ethiopia has become a model in green development initiative which other countries need to replicate it, African Risk Capacity said. Director General of ARC Group and the United Nations Assistant Secretary General Ibrahim Cheki Dong said that Ethiopia has done a splendid job on carbon emission and minimizing climate-induced impact. Johannes Fanton has more on this.
African Risk Capacity is an institution that consists of 35 African countries as members and is established to respond quickly to various disasters that occur in the member states and to carry out activities that can withstand climate change. In a press briefing given on the sidelines of the 36th African Union Summit, it was revealed that disaster prevention institutions in African countries are not able to reduce the amount of damage caused by disasters in the continent because of lack of coordination.
In most of our countries, the problem with disaster management, the responsibility lies in different ministries, different government entities, and unfortunately, any lack of coordination could cost life and livelihood. So it is extremely critical that our government entities actually coordinate themselves. So there is an intervention that's highly coordinated, and that's why preparation is important.
The Director General said that Ethiopia has tremendous experience in mitigating climate change through tree planting. According to him, this Ethiopian Green Initiative development would be helpful to tackle the drought-related and other natural risks in the country as well as in the region.
In the case of climate change, the two aspects of intervention is mitigation and adaptation. On the mitigation front, the advice being given to many of our countries to favor what we call tree planting, but also land management. And Ethiopia has tremendous experience on that fall. And the same way in the rest of Africa, they're also pushing what they call the Great Wall. And this is really an initiative that's pushed by many African countries, at least to restore the land, but also the tree, so we can actually reduce the emission that you have in the gas. So what Ethiopia has as a model, this is something certainly we're interested in seeing, but other countries can learn from that and replicate that model as well.
In its 10 years of launching African Risk Capacity, firstly with a drought insurance program has made payout of over $900 million to participating African governments as a result of drought and tropical cyclone events affecting countries in the continent. And about its future ambitions, the Director General went on to say the following.
As of today, ARC has about 35 member states. And now you know Africa is more than 35, with 55. So our ambition is to make sure that every African country become a member of ARC so we can demonstrate the leadership of Africa in dealing with disaster management. Second, disaster does not mean the same thing to all of our countries. In other words, drought may be prevalent in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel. It may not be the case in other countries. So we want to diversify the product that we offer to our member states from drought, tropical cyclone, outbreak and epidemic, and flood to make sure we can address the relevant disasters affecting our member states. Going forward also, we need to amplify the African voice and concerns at COP28. It is extremely critical for Africans to be fully coordinated. So when they go to this big event, the African voice and concerns are heard loud and clear, and we will definitely utilize our experience as a convening power and make sure the African voice is actually coordinated.
African Risk Capacity is a specialized agency of the African Union established in 2012 to help member states better plan, prepare and respond to the natural disasters and manage risks.
And finally, Chinese President Xi Jinping said he is ready to work with African leaders to further strengthen China-Africa friendship and cooperation. Chinese President Xi Jinping sent a congratulatory message to the 36th African Union Summit. In his message, President Xi Jinping pointed out that over the past year, the AU has united and led African countries to actively address global challenges, accelerate the construction of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and play an important role in mediating hotspot issues. He added the international status and influence of Africa have continuously risen. The Chinese president stressed that China-Africa relations maintain a good momentum of development in 2022 as China-Africa cooperation has continued to develop in an all-round, multi-level and high-quality manner and is at in front of international cooperation with the Africa. Xi said he is ready to work with African leaders to further strengthen China-Africa friendship and cooperation, closely coordinate and cooperate in international and regional affairs, and promote the building of a high-level China-African community with a shared future.
Africa is the second largest continent with a population of more than 1.4 billion. But what is the Africa that we want?
An Africa that's free of civil war and corruption.
An Africa that is resilient.
An Africa that has citizens who are proud of being an African.
An Africa that is free from hunger.
An Africa that is self-sufficient and prosperous.
That is the Africa we want. And these are the stories ETV will bring to you.
And now a quick reminder of the top stories once again. Scholar reiterates African solution for African problems is making a significant difference. And Ethiopia observes 86 Matters Day. You've been watching at this news hour with me, Binyam Getana. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye for me now. Have a peaceful time.